Okay, turn you on. All right. I have too many things open on my laptop. Front, back, dimmed. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to SOC 377. So hopefully everyone is doing well. Happy Friday, second Friday of the semester. 12 Fridays left to go. Not that anyone's counting. No, I'm not counting, but the math is not hard to do. All right, so today, obviously, I'll answer that in a sec. Obviously, we got started talking about our different generational cohorts last time. We started talking a little bit about the silence, right? So we set up a couple of things, right? The silence, or we set up our two kind of critical concepts, right? We have our technology theory of generations. Very important for this account that we're getting from Twenge. The technology that is central when people are in their teens and 20s ultimately shapes their experience of the world in really fundamental ways. So that's our technology theory of generations. And then we have our life theory, or what is it? Life history theory. Sorry, I knew I was missing a word. Life history theory, right, where Twenge suggests that there's two kind of choices that people have. Our fast life strategy, have a lot of kids, get them to the point where they can take care of themselves to a basic extent before one or both parents die, right? More typical of the past, at least for us. And then, the slow life strategy where people have a small number of children and invest a lot of energy in those few children because, the societies are more competitive, more resource constrained in some ways. And therefore, it's going to be difficult to get your kid a great future because there's so much competition from other kids. All right. And like I said, increasingly, this is where we are. And we can say this has probably been the case since, at least the boomers. But as we've moved, forward from the boomers, it gets to be more and more the case all the time. Okay. So we started talking, hang on, and let me go back. So the graphs that we're talking about here, I'd already forgotten the question. That's how Friday today is. One of those days I haven't had 2 seconds to spare. Meetings, and all that jazz. Okay. All of these graphs are from the US, but I'll make some kind of general comments on Canada as well as we go. So we're talking about the silence rate, this generation born, there we go, 1925 to 1945, sometimes also called the traditionalists and the lucky generation, right, for lots of reasons. What the point that Twenge makes and what we talked about on this slide is that for the talk of how traditional they are, and in some ways they're very traditional, they were also at the cusp and sort of the initiating generation for a lot of the social changes that the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z would live through. And largely, a lot of the things that they sort of kicked off, the boomers ended up taking credit for. Okay, technology, right, very quickly recapitulate this. TV and jet travel are pretty important for both of them. And then we ended off, I guess on these two slides. The silence, they're a little bit different. There's something a little different about the way they approached life, especially early. They got married quite early as compared to other few 16-year-olds, but some, right? And some of these were shotgun weddings, right? Someone got pregnant and therefore families pushed to have them get married because that was the social norm at the time. But a lot of them just wanted to get married and they, met their spouses largely in high school. And because, the economy that they were coming into was so good, they were able to get good jobs, men were able to get good jobs and propose marriage to women quite early with the promise that, they could provide them with a good livelihood. Okay, I answered you. I have no mouse. Where are you, mouse? There you are. Clear. And this is where we ended off, right? We're talking about the silents and their babies, right? So this, right, so the silents, they had a lot of babies, as the slide title will suggest, right? Considerably higher, what's called TFR. And one of your classmates asked me a question about this last class, and I realized I didn't explain TFR, or what this number means. And you might know if you've taken some demography, but you might not. Okay, so this measurement that we're seeing here, right, 2.5 children per woman, this is what's referred to as total fertility rate, right? So this is roughly the number of children per woman that we expect someone to have in their fertile years, right? And the fertile range for women, for demographers, is generally, again, right, slightly lower, 15 to 44. So 15 to 44, right? Obviously, before which having children is rare, right? Most 12, 13, 14-year-olds don't have children. And, beyond 44, not many women are having children either. There's rare cases, but it doesn't happen. So our TFR is children per woman, right? So children per woman, right? Now, generally speaking, in an industrialized society with kind of relatively modern medicine, we have a replacement rate. So how many children per woman you need to have basically the population stay stable is 2.1, right? And we'll come back to this number over and over again in the course. But 2.1 children per woman, is replacement fertility. This is obviously, like, the silents were way above that, which is why you see explosive population growth, when they are adults. Later generations will have fewer, and we'll see that total fertility rate dip well below replacement by the time we hit the 1970s. Okay, but the silents, right, at 3.8 are super fertile. And we see this reflected in the number of children born during this period. Now, it's not all fun and games, right? Total fertility spikes for the silents up to about 3.8, but it stays, obviously that's a really high peak right here, but it stays quite high, right? It'll stay above 3 children per woman, into 1965, and doesn't really go back to kind of 2.5 until, 1968, and then, below that kind of steady. But after the silents kind of exit that, peak childbearing window, right? And, peak childbearing is going to be roughly 18 to about 30, 32, after which it gets much harder to have children. Okay, so the women in this period, though, they started working as well. There's more of them going back to work, taking advantage of the growing service industry to, double family incomes or provide for themselves for all sorts of reasons. But often, they were the ones expected to do all the domestic work as well, which is where some significant number of the sort of feminist complaints and feminist critiques of the social order come from when we get into the 60s and 70s. Okay, so I guess that's where we left it off. So the silents. Interestingly, right, they've remained through their whole life course quite resilient to anxiety, right? Whereas other generations, the boomers, notably, so their children, have been quite anxious, right, and have exhibited really, really high rates of anxiety, right? And we see this, what is this chart, right? This is our levels of reported anxiety. We see the difference between born 1946 and later and, born 1945 and before are silents, right? So they have been remarkably resilient to anxiety, right? The rates of anxiety considerably lower than other diagnosed anxiety, considerably lower than other generational cohorts. And the theory that Twenge puts forward, and that has been put forward about them, is that they have consistently been more socially connected than other generations, largely owing to the large families they had, right? So, and they're a kind of modern aberration, right? In modernity, the trend has been towards smaller families. The Silents had really big families, and so they remained quite connected to those families, and then a whole bunch of social institutions as well, right? The Silents are probably the last generation to be really deeply integrated on a kind of daily basis into the social institutions of their communities, right? For which that was kind of their central focus. Things like social clubs, societies, political parties, and religious organization, largely churches for the Silents, have been really, really important, and they stayed connected to them for their whole lives. And that seems to have buffered them largely against isolation and anxiety, right? Okay, and what Twenge says, large families that are more intimately connected mean they're less prone to isolationism, depression, and self-harm, including suicide. And I can say, right, like my wife's grandmother, it was, for me, kind of an interesting example of this, right? So she's definitely a Silent, right? All of her kids are baby boomers. So my in-laws, or my mother-in-law, and her 3 sisters and 2 brothers, right? All baby boomers. But what's interesting is, as my wife's grandmother got older, they were much more socially connected to her, right? Visiting her, like they arranged between the 6 siblings, I have to count them in my head, 6 siblings, to visit her at least every other day. Someone was phoning her on those other days and keeping her quite socially integrating, making sure that she got, off to church on Sunday and all of those things. Something that's really possible if you have a relatively large family, but much more difficult if, say, you had 1 or 2 children, which would be the norm for later generations, right? And so we see more connection, less social isolation, and therefore, less depression, self-harm, and including suicide. Okay. Why is replacement fertility 2.1? Shouldn't it be 2? Okay, so here's the sad truth. Some children die. Boys more than girls. Boys are more vulnerable to disease, and what's the other word? Stupider. Boys do stupider things, right? So boys inherently are more risk tolerant, and will do things like jump off the high thing or climb the thing that shouldn't be climbed. And so boys die at a slightly higher rate than girls. So you need that extra 0.1 to make up for stupid and sick, right? Stupid and sick, right? Because not every child survives. So it has to be just above 2. Now, given modern medicine, it doesn't have to be much above 2 because very few children die by historical standards, right? So, but yes, you always have to account for dumb. Okay, ooh, I have a doodle on here. I should not have that. Do I have more doodles as I go forward? No, that's the last one. Okay. Apparently I forgot to clear the ink on this slide, but that's okay. All right, let's talk our baby boomers, right? So this is our generation born from 1946 to 1964. And this includes my dad. My dad born in 1940, and my mom, my dad. But the reason I'm thinking of my dad for this one is it's my dad's birthday today. January 16th, 1947, which I have to phone him after class. I forgot one year, and I'm still hearing about it. That was like 10 years ago. So I have to remember that. So yes, the baby boomers, right? And again, that's these babies, right? Born right through this kind of spike. Oops. So the baby boomers, right? So the baby boom, this period of enormous demographic inflation starts basically as soon as the Second World War ends. A lot of people have suggested that it is the returning soldiers right now getting married and starting families. I don't know that necessarily kind of fits, because a lot of the people who are involved in the baby boom actually didn't go to war, right? They're the silent generation that managed to avoid the war in large part. But the end of the war does bring some interesting things. And specifically, and I mentioned this last time, right? The period of 1945 until somewhere in the 1970s, I usually put it at 1973, with the beginning of the Arab oil embargoes and a pretty pronounced recession in the United States. But this period from 1945 to 1973 is a period of, like, an extended period, one of the longest of consistent economic growth and prosperity. And it's marked by all sorts of really odd social circumstances that the people at the time sort of take as the norm, but really isn't the norm. Things like inequality, right? So economic inequality, the gap between the richest and the average being the smallest that it has ever been. And, given the way things are going, probably the smallest it's ever going to be, right? It's a period of, where the working class and workers have enormous power, and they can command great wages, great benefits. And they get quite wealthy by historical standards because there's kind of a shortage of workers in a lot of ways. So, booming economy, not enough workers, wages go high. The gap between, owners or the bourgeoisie, if you want to put it in Marxist terms, and the proletariat gets small and is the smallest it's essentially ever going to be. And along with this, right, seems to come a huge demographic explosion. And it is a very long, demographic explosion. The baby boom is quite long, right? Going from 1946 to about 1964. And I think not for nothing, right? It ends about 4 years after the birth control pill is approved as a contraceptive in the United States. So, women get much more control over their fertility, and they choose to have far fewer children. Okay, now for me, this is always a wild number, so I like to highlight it. By the time it ended, 76 million babies had been born in the United States, right? And in Canada, and I think Canada had a pretty small population at the time, somewhere around 24 million. In Canada, it's about 8 million babies had been born, right? So, fully a third more population, roughly. But in the United States, about 76 million babies had been born, and that is more than the current population of the United Kingdom. It's more than the current population of France. And it's about half the population of the Russian Federation. So in this less than 2 decade period, an entire France appeared, right? A France worth of babies. Even more actually, because I think France is only about 65 million people. So it's more than the population of France just was born in this period, right? And this, to say that this is another kind of social revolution would be sort of underplaying it, because the baby boomers, because of how big of a generational cohort they are, will dominate the landscape for their entire lives, right? And they're not gone yet. Thank God. I love my dad and my mom. If they could stick around for a little while longer, be very grateful for that. But they continue to, can we talk about this in very recent terms? Last year, Canada had an election, and pretty much every generational cohort other than the baby boomers sort of leaned towards the Conservatives, but the boomers leaned heavily towards the Liberals, and who won? It was the Liberals, right? So Mark Carney owes his, I was going to say his existence, but no, he would exist either way. But he owes his political career largely to the boomers because they still sort of control our destinies. Okay, so big, demographic explosion, right? If we're talking just North America, we're talking about 84 million new people just kind of appear we know how they appeared, but they are born in this period, which is crazy. And it's a reversal of a more than 200-year trend of declining birth rates, right? So even before contraception, birth rates had been declining. You get this baby boom, and then they start declining again. So baby boomers are their existence is a sort of historical aberration. I won't phrase it that way when I talk to my dad today, though. Happy birthday. Your very existence is a sort of historical aberration. I'm sure I'd get comments about that one. Okay, So, yeah, and like I said, the boomers have dominated the landscape for their whole lives, and their lives aren't over. Okay, so the boomers, right? Today we think of them as conservative in a lot of ways, and they did get more conservative as they got older, but in their youth, right, they internalized a lot of the changes that started with the silence and kind of pushed those changes forward. So, more rights for African Americans in particular, but other racial groups as well, right? They expanded rights for minorities. Women's rights obviously flourished under the boomers, right? Especially around questions of reproduction, and gay and lesbian rights. And here, I'm saying that very deliberately. It's the LG, the B and the T and the other letters come after. For the boomers, they're mostly concerned with gay and lesbian rights rather than the other things that kind of follow, right? So, it's just the LG for them for the most part. Okay. And the boomers, I think more so than the silence, rejected what they saw as outdated prejudices, and they were much more individualistic, right? It's not that the silence didn't have a certain degree of individualism, but we talked about, right, they were a little bit more community-oriented, a little bit more collectivist in their thinking, and certainly more likely to follow kind of cultural scripts. The boomers, in large part, kind of reject that, and nowhere is this more apparent than on their attitudes on sex. Now, their attitudes on sex are largely said they were okay, that it was okay to have sex before marriage, while most silence and the greatest generation said no, right? 85% of adults said sex before marriage was wrong in 1967. So a lot of the boomers are still too young to be counted in that. By 1979, when we get most of the boomers in there, that number's dropped to 37%, right? And if that's not a revolution in sort of beliefs about sexuality, I don't know what is. Okay, other things, right? Obviously, the boomers are known for their, shall we say, liberal drug use, particularly marijuana, but things like LSD, were also quite popular. Hallucinogenics and some other things. I don't have a list of boomer drugs, but, weed was the big one, followed by hallucinogenics like LSD. So, they were pretty liberal about those things, especially, in their teens and 20s. Okay, I will tell my dad the class wishes him a happy birthday. Yes, that is also true. So the baby boom's a little bit more concentrated in North America than it is even other places. There is a sort of population surge in, say, Western Europe, a little bit in, say, the Soviet Union and parts of Eastern Europe as well. But the economic conditions are very different, right? Europe spends most of the 40s and 50s rebuilding from the destruction of the Second World War. And so the social conditions aren't quite as good there. So you do see a population surge, but it's not as pronounced. The other thing is the European countries on the whole suffered higher casualties, both civilian and military. So there's fewer people there to have babies. And in the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union, what is it? They suffered like 60 million casualties in the Second World War. The number is astronomical. So there's a surge, right? And obviously a lot of returning soldiers, people starting families. There is an economic boom in the Soviet Union that runs, not as long, maybe to the end of the 1950s, largely driven by rearmament, right? The Soviets being like, we're going to be ready to fight the next war when it comes. But it doesn't last as long and it's not as pronounced, right? Simply because, the social conditions, I think, aren't as good and the economy is not as good. And then other parts of the world just have really high fertility because, essentially they're pre-industrial still. As they industrialize, their birth rates will actually decline. And they don't experience the same kind of baby booms. Though, you do see surges in population driven by improving medicine in places like China and India as well. Less infant mortality. I don't have, our dads have the same birthday. I mean, it has to happen, right? Like, eventually 2 people will be born on the same day. My dad doesn't get it all to himself. I don't think. Okay. Right, I answered you. I'll leave that there because I like it. Okay, so 30 minutes has gone by already. So, television. Now, I know we talked about television with the silence, and maybe it gets a little confusing because television comes up with the silence and it comes up with Gen X too in slightly different contexts. Okay, so TV is really important with the boomers as well. And unlike the silence, right, who kind of remember a time without television, kind of like the millennials will remember a time without the internet. The boomers, for a large part of that generation, the older part of the boomers will remember when television came in, when they were quite young. But the kind of younger part of, it feels funny to talk about the younger part of a cohort when that, they're now in their like late 60s. But the younger part of the boomer cohort doesn't remember a time without television, right? It was there essentially from the time that they were children. So they're the first generation raised with television at the center of their lives. And yeah, it expands their horizons in interesting ways and makes the world in a lot of ways much more present to them, right? And I talked a little bit about the difference between the Korean War and the Vietnam War last time, right? The Korean War, which was quite brutal, with high casualties on both the UN and the Chinese/Korean side, didn't attract the same kind of public response, I think largely because it wasn't as visible. Whereas TV brought the Vietnam War to people's living rooms, and a lot of the terrible things that, say the Americans did, things like the My Lai massacre, right, to your living room. And that was a big change. And so you saw a lot of social movements, sort of coalescing around this very visual medium. And, a lot of people looking at the Vietnam War and saying like, wow, that's really brutal. We don't want anything to do with that. Okay, 2 other kind of sets of technologies that are obviously really important. So, birth control, right? And like I said, birth control in the US is introduced in 1960. It had been around for a couple years as a treatment for, feminine bleeding disorders, but it's officially approved as a contraceptive in 1960. Canada's a little bit later. It's not until 1968 that the birth control pill is approved. But, people are already using it somewhat widely by that point, getting it for other purposes. So the birth control pill is obviously a massive technological change, right? It kicks off what's widely known as the sexual revolution, and revolutionizes the relationship between men and women in really significant ways, and in ways that I think are still playing out today, right? We're still dealing with this, put it this way, it's kind of a depth charge, under Western society or any society that adopts the technology. Maybe in 1960, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but the ripple effects of the introduction of contraception, we're still feeling them today, right? And they kind of get bigger and bigger as they go out. So the biggest thing it does, obviously, is separate sex from conception, right? It splits sex off from babies, right? At least to a degree. It's not perfect, right? And no contraception is perfect, which is why very shortly after contraception becomes legal, there's really strong pushes to make abortion legal as well as a sort of fallback for when, contraception fails. And it allows for, obviously, much greater sexual experimentation, but for both men and women, right? But particularly for women, where it takes a lot of the risk out of it, right? Because women disproportionately bear the risk of getting pregnant and having a child because, that bond is a lot more immediate. It's much more difficult to separate it, whereas men find it much easier to walk away. So birth control is huge. And it's the technology, I think, that's most often cited as revolutionary for the boomers and for the generations that follow. Now, other technologies that I think are really important, and there are a few books that make this case, and I actually kind of strongly believe in this case as well, is that there's a whole category of labor-saving devices that come into the market. Now, the silent certainly take advantage of them as well, but their impact seems to have been the biggest for the boomers, especially for women, right? And these are, technologies that you probably think are quite mundane. But I think there's a really strong case to be made that these technologies play at least as big a role in women's liberation or feminism as the birth control pill does. So the washing machine, the dishwasher, the microwave, potentially, vacuum, the great and powerful, that thing that all cats fear, the vacuum cleaner. Why are these technologies so important? Okay, very simply, they're really important because they essentially automate, right? And we'll see automation again as a term, but they automate domestic tasks. And these tasks are largely tasks that, prior to their kind of wide-scale adoption, people spent a lot of time doing, and a lot of time, and particularly women, right? Women spent a lot of time doing the things that these technologies automated, right? So I think of washing clothes, and I feel like I still live in an interesting space where, my parents are old enough, in a sense, to remember what the world was like before these technologies were in the market. My mom especially, grew up a very poor farm family up in northern Alberta, right? And, talking to my mom's always interesting because she describes what it was like for my grandma to wash clothes. And remember, my mom is from a family of 14, so you can imagine how much clothes that was. And there were babies all the time and cloth diapers, so that's a lot of diapers, right? And it involved, a wash basin with water that you heated up on the stove, put in the wash basin, and there was like a scrubbing board that you would scrub the clothes on to get it clean with the soap. And this was a process that took hours, right? And it was never done. You were always washing clothes. There was always more clothes to wash. Eventually they got a machine that basically automated. You crank the handle and it did the washing for you, but you still had to stand there. The washing machine takes all of that away, right? The washing machine, you throw it in, you hook it up to water, and you leave for an hour, and you're free to go do something else. And can wash clothes very, very quickly. This is true of the dishwasher as well, right? You stick all your dishes in the dishwasher. My children have yet to master this task, but whatever. I'm sure they'll figure it out one day. Apparently, all the dishes go next to the dishwasher. Who knew? Magically, and I feel like it needs like tentacles to reach out and put the dishes in. I need a dishwasher octopus of some kind. Anyway, right? When they do put it in, you push it, and in an hour you have clean dishes. You didn't have to stand there and wash each individual fork for yourself. Now, what this does, and put it in very Marxist terms, is it automates much of the work of social reproduction, right? And the work of social reproduction from Marxist scholars, right, is the work of just keeping the family going so that the workers, right, typically men, could go out into the world the next day and continue to work. So they have to be fed, they have to be clothed, that clothes has to be clean, children have to be cared for, right? These technologies made a lot of that simpler. And basically, women needed to spend way less time on domestic tasks than prior generations. And what did they, so now having that time freed up, what did they use that time for? They used it to work. What's that? Barbiturates. Some, right? Certainly some of them, took drugs, antidepressants, and drank. But, in a lot of cases they went to work, right? Because there was less domestic labor to do. So they go back out into the workplace and they spend their lives working because you don't need as much effort to just keep the house going, right? Now, I would add to this, things like manufactured clothing becomes much more the norm. Right, clothing that you buy through catalogs and at general stores becomes much more normal than making your own clothes, which was another thing that women did, spent a lot of time doing. Canning also plays a role, right? Women used to spend a lot of time canning the goods from their gardens, and suddenly you could go buy a tin of beans at the grocery store So again, relatively cheap. And so those things also freed up a lot of time for women. But I think these domestic technologies tell a big part of the story. Okay. How did the generations after the boomers become more conservative, learning about movements in history of inequality and such? Oh, we'll get to that. The women went to work. It's also a rise in getting GEDs. Yeah, I mean, they got more education, right? They got more, more of them finished education, more of them finished high school, right? Again, all freed up by essentially, there's less need to be at home, right? There's more time for girls to stay in school. There's more jobs for them as well, right? There's more purpose in getting an education as a woman when you know you can get a job that pays you decent wages, right? So economic dependency on men declines as well. And again, we're going to talk about this. You're going to be so sick of hearing about how women became economically independent, that I was going to say you're going to wish it never happened, but no, of course you won't. But no, you're going to get tired of me repeating this fact because it's sort of obvious, but it's historically super important as well. Okay, is that the last? Okay, yes, good. Okay, the boomers, right? They're also super individualistic. Boomer individualism starts with rejecting rules of society. And one of the weird ways that this manifests is in the way they name their kids, right? You start getting, you go from a very small set of names for boys and girls to the boomers really want to, shall we say, expand the palette of possible names. And then, it gets to, I want to say anything insulting. When you get to the millennials, right, it becomes sort of a naming your child something authentic or unique becomes almost a fetish, right, where you have to replace otherwise perfectly serviceable letters with letters that make no sense. Or make up names. We have a couple of friends. They're friends of my wife's, not mine. But I don't know why that's important. I feel like it is. 100% all of their children have names that are just made up because they're like French Canadian like we are, and their names, I'm like, where does that name come from? And they're like, well, we combined this name with that name. And I'm like, you've condemned that child to an entire life of spelling their name every time they have to do anything. Better get comfortable with those NATO call letters because, you got M's and N's in there, and that's going to be fun to spell. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Or is it? Name your children normal things. Like, it can be unique, but don't make it so unique that, it's impossible to spell. That was my goal. Okay, so the boomers, very individualistic. It starts out as this idea of kind of rejecting rules, but by the 1980s, their focus kind of changes, right? And this is often, sort of the joke culturally is that people sell out, right? They start as hippies in the 60s and 70s, and then by the 1980s, they're working at a corporate job wearing a suit, right? They've become the company man their father was, and they swore they'd never be. But the 1980s, is quite dominated by a quest for self-discovery. And the boomers, this quest for self-discovery and authenticity becomes a sort of elite motif of their lives, right? The leading thing that they are sort of really, really interested in. They're really disconnected from kind of larger social institutions as well. And they begin this trend, and certainly when we get to Gen Z, we're going to see that this trend doesn't stop with the boomers, but they begin this trend of sort of really separating from social institutions. Part of this is sort of structural, right? Their parents moved out from the city centers to the suburbs that are less sort of dense with institutions, what you might call third spaces. But the boomers certainly continue this trend and sort of separate from a lot of things, right? Rates of religiosity start to decline quite sharply with the boomers, especially when they're in their 20s and 30s. But general social connections get quite a bit weaker as well. And I think not for nothing, the boomers report struggling with mental health at 2 to 3 times more than the silents do. Now, some people will object to this in the sense that, is this just more reporting? Are the boomers and subsequent generations just more open to talking about sort of, mental health than prior generations were. And certainly that's true, but even on markers that are relatively objective, right? And I say relatively, I mean absolutely objective. Things like suicide, right? Which is a statistic that's tracked by the state. And we have data on suicide going back well into the 19th century because it's been something that the state tracks really carefully. Even on a really objective measure, not one that's self-reported, the boomers do much worse than their parents did, right? Okay, and yeah, it starts in their college years and lingers, and persists into their 70s, right? And I think the oldest of the boomers are basically 80 years old this year. So they're now just exiting their 80s. So this has been them their whole lives, right? Lower rates of mental health than their parents had. Suicide rates for boomers are higher than for the silents or the greatest generation. An American born in 1964, that last year of the baby boom, 35% more likely to take their own life than one born in 1935, which is, kind of in the middle of the silent generation, right? So, once they aged into the 40s, their 45 to 50 demographic, right? This is a while ago now. But once they aged into that demographic of 45 to 54, kind of middle age, deaths of despair, right? And we'll talk about these again, especially when we talk about men later in the course. But deaths of despair are things like suicide, obviously, overdose, typically from opioids, and liver failure, right, which you get from drinking too much, increased, especially amongst working class whites, or white people. Once they hit the 55 to 64, like beginning senior citizen demographic, the rates of deaths of despair for all of the boomers, right, not just white people, but white people, African Americans, Latinos, and indigenous people. Is that a question? Yeah. Okay, yeah, sir, go.
No, all good. At 45 to 54, like, I don't know how many of them would have, but the Vietnam War,
so it's,
could the people that had served because there was less,
social services for veterans? Oh, that's an interesting theory.
For, suicide or, deaths of despair, opioids, things like that.
So yes, it's still a relatively small percentage of the population that served in Vietnam, right? So I can't remember the exact percentage of Americans, it's almost exclusively men, who served in Vietnam, but it's not a huge percentage, right? It's a relatively small percentage of the population. So it might account for some, but shouldn't account for all of it, right? And wars are interesting because you sometimes see the psychological effects of war 5, 10, 15, 20 years prior to people returning. Anyway, I could talk about that, but let's not. Not that it's not interesting, it's just not our focus. Okay, so death rates for all boomers rose, as they entered 55 to 64, largely driven by deaths of despair, because deaths from cancer and heart disease actually were in decline, right? As better medical technology allowed better survivability for all of those things. Now, what Twenge suggests, and I think this is kind of a widely held theory, is that this is probably largely driven by less stable relationships, increased individualism, and less integration into social institutions, right? So they're just lonelier people. They have fewer friends, they have fewer children, so they're less connected they're connected to their children, but they have fewer of them, so they're connected to fewer people. There's less people to talk to them, to visit them, and all of those things as they get older. And especially once they start exiting the workplace, right, they often find a kind of crisis of purpose. 2 minutes? How are we doing for 2 minutes? Oh, I don't want to start Gen X with 2 minutes. We're going to just go. We're going to stop. Because I can't start a new generation with 2 minutes left. All right, why don't we continue? We'll continue this on Monday. We'll talk about Gen X and then the best generation, the millennials, and then the worst generation, Gen Z. No, I'm kidding. You're all lovely. Let's trudge forward with this as we go. Gen X is super fascinating. Galileo. What a terrible name. No, that's actually not bad. I actually don't mind that one. That's kind of cute. I also knew someone who had a dog named Galileo, so I don't know what that says.
I feel like that fits more for a dog than a child. I don't know why.
I think so too. But then I feel the same way about Chloe. I don't know why.
No, that makes sense because my friend's dog is named Chloe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and Abigail to me has always been a cow name, and I don't know why.
that was interesting. A few. My family's farming family.
Okay,
Dairy farmer.
then you've encountered a lot of cows, but no Abigail. PETA. After the organization or the character from the Hunger Games? Okay, well that's good. Ironic. Hello. How are you doing?
So it's like the first couple of weeks.
Okay,
Just have some questions.
sure.
Do we have any book for this?
No, it's all just readings posted on Canvas.
All the slides, right? There are also like some readings. Do we need to know that?
They're sort of like supplemental, right?
Okay.
So you can do them if you want. They can be helpful, but they're not required. There's nothing in them that I don't talk about in the class that you would need to